I was frozen when I saw my wife at a romantic dinner with her boss and without a wedding ring. She saw me. And it froze too. That paralysis in her eyes said more than any words that could have come out of her mouth. But he didn't say anything. Nothing. There was no justification, no staged surprise. There was not even an attempt to call me by name, to explain, to pretend. She just remained there, motionless, her fingers intertwined with his on the table, her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost, in her left hand, where the ring that symbolized almost a decade of married life should have been, completely naked. And, at that moment, as the waiter, without understanding anything, approached with expensive wine and 2 tall glasses, a single scene began to form in my head, that of divorce. But not just any divorce. It would be epic. The biggest irony. She thought she was invisible. That I would never find out. That the small gestures, the lies carefully covered by tired smiles and the constant absence of desire would be enough to keep me in ignorance. He believed that the deleted messages, the extended work hours and the extraordinary meetings that appeared on weekends were clever devices. But the truth, that cruel and inevitable truth, presented itself before me with a coldness that cut my spine. She was in love with someone else. And more, by someone who pretended to greet me in the hallway, who called me brother at company events, and who smiled with those perfectly aligned teeth, as if each one was a calculated stab in my chest. The scene looked like cheap theater. The restaurant, the kind with yellowish lighting and piano music in the background, served as a stage. Her boss, sitting across from her, was wearing the same watch he complimented me on months ago. She was wearing the burgundy dress that I bought on a trip, which, according to her, was too beautiful to be worn on any occasion. His hands caressed her fingers, and the way he watched her. God! No man looks at a woman like that unless he has already crossed all limits. And her? She smiled. Until you see me. Then, her face slowly went out, like a candle in a cold room. She tried to stand up, the chair receding slightly into the floor. But he didn't say anything. Me either. I looked around and saw the scene as if I were outside my body, a man standing, betrayed, confused, and 2 lovers frozen in guilt. The waiter hesitated. A couple at the next table looked at us. I just turned my back and left. But at that moment, something broke in me. Something irreversible. A deep, painful crack that could no longer be ignored or patched up with lukewarm excuses. What she didn't know, and he didn't either, was that she had chosen the wrong person to deceive. They believed that I was just another complacent husband, another one of those men who swallow betrayal for fear of scandal, for fear of loneliness, for fear of what would come next. But no. What would come next, was already brewing inside me like a storm about to sweep away everything. Because that betrayal wasn't just marital. She was emotional, moral, professional. And, worse, it was premeditated. I knew. I saw it clearly now. Every word of hers these past few weeks made sense, the disguised absences, the praise for her boss's strategic talent, the supposedly business dinners on random days. Everything made sense now, like pieces of a sinister puzzle assembled in light of my naivety. The next morning, I arrived at work like someone going to war. Smiling, polite, with my briefcase in one hand and coffee in the other. I knew they would both be there. Like always. She knew that he, her lover, her boss, would continue to play the fair and friendly superior, and she, the dedicated and efficient professional. What no one knew was that, 2 years ago, the board of directors had made me a minority partner in the company after a contribution that saved the company from a silent financial crisis. I never boasted about it. I have always preferred anonymity and discretion. While others fought for vanity and power, I invested in silence. And that day, that would be my letter. I asked for an extraordinary meeting with the board. I showed documents. Evidence. And I exposed, without hysteria, without melodrama, everything I knew. The improper relationship, the breach of trust, the impact on the team's results, the use of company resources for personal purposes. Each word I said was a precise bullet to the boss's ego. And when I called her into the room, the silence became sepulchral. She came in and saw all the faces turned towards her. She didn't understand right away. But when she saw me there, sitting at the head of the table, and understood that I was in charge, the blood drained from her face. And, with a coldness I didn't know existed in me, I announced, they were both fired. And there, at that exact moment, I revealed who I really was. The hidden investor. The name on the company's rescue contract. The man they underestimated. The husband they betrayed. And the humiliation, oh, that humiliation that crossed both their faces was almost a consolation, but not enough. She tried to argue, plead, justify. It was a mistake, an oversight, a lack, but I didn't listen anymore. Her every word beat against a heart that was no longer hers. And what did I see in her eyes? It wasn't regret. It was fear. Fear of having lost comfort, status, security. Fear of having bet everything on a lover who was now also unemployed. The following days were a whirlwind. The press began to sniff out the story. The leak of internal information, the suspicion of embezzlement of funds, the gossip from corridors. The company went into an image crisis, but I remained calm. I had a plan. And he had the advantage of having nothing to hide. The scandal hit them both like a whirlwind. But the most curious thing, and here's the detail that changes everything, is what happened afterwards. When everything seemed to fall apart, when the bitter taste of disappointment still burned in my throat, I met her. Not as someone who seeks consolation. Not like someone looking to fill a void. But like someone, even after an earthquake, finds something beautiful among the rubble. She appeared without warning, with silent strength, with a gaze that sought nothing but the truth. And that's when I realized, the betrayal had destroyed me, but it had also freed me. Because if I hadn't seen what I saw in that restaurant, I might never have known the value of loyalty. Maybe I would continue living a well-staged lie. Maybe I was still stuck in the lukewarm love of someone who had left me a long time ago. Betrayal opened my eyes, and my heart. And that's when everything changes. Because there's one final detail, one event that none of them expected. Something that happened days later, something that proved that fate has a sense of justice that isn't always immediate, but is always relentless. A detail that completely turned the tables. And that's what, well, that's something you'll only understand when you know exactly what happened in that last meeting, at the moment when she thought she had already lost everything, but there was still more to lose. Much more. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or condone any type of betrayal. All stories told are fictional, but they carry profound truths about the real damage that disloyalty causes in people's lives. The moral is clear: cheating destroys. Get ready. What you will hear now is a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. Thomas and Elena met on a sultry spring afternoon, during a business conference that seemed, to both of them, to be just another bureaucratic event in the midst of their hectic routines. But there was something in that exchange of looks that defied the ordinary. She, with her brown hair tied in a tight bun, wore an elegant, discreet navy blue dress, and a confident voice that contrasted with the nervousness of the beginning speakers. He, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows and a curious look, was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. That day, without knowing it, they had begun building a bond that would last for years, sealed by affection, ambition and a shared vision of the future. There was no rush between them. Conversations came like wine being slowly poured, each word filling the space with meaning. The meetings, initially sporadic, turned into frequent dinners, walks under the dim light of the city and confidences exchanged to the sound of jazz. When Thomas, months later, held Elena's hand in front of a small crowd of friends and family and said, yes, there was more in his eyes than love, there was admiration, there was respect. The wedding was simple but memorable. They chose a discreet hall in the middle of a modern art gallery, surrounded by paintings that seemed to pulse with the same intensity that they felt in their chests. It wasn't extravagance that they wanted, but authenticity. And they found it not only in that place, but in each other. Thomas had always been a meticulous man, silently protective, the kind of man who prefers to resolve conflicts with gestures rather than confrontation. He worked in the investment sector of a large corporation, dealing with calculated risks and high-level negotiations, but he never allowed the cynicism of the market to contaminate his character. Elena, on the other hand, was pure energy. Intelligent, perceptive, with an impressive memory and an almost hypnotic social skill, she was capable of captivating any room. Her work in the area of strategic communications at the same company where Thomas would later become a shareholder was praised by colleagues and superiors. Despite their different personalities, there was balance between them. She brought lightness to Thomas's days of rigidity, and he, in turn, offered solidity in the moments when Elena's life became a whirlwind of decisions and commitments. In the early years, mornings were filled with simple rituals: coffee passed by Thomas while Elena put on makeup while listening to podcasts, messages left on the mirror with lipstick or in notes stuck on the refrigerator, silent hugs at dinner time, when there weren't always words, but there was always presence. The house they chose was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and a garden that Thomas insisted on tending personally, even on the coldest weekends. Sundays were sacred days, to cook together, watch old movies, or simply do nothing but exist side by side. Over time, the demands of the job intensified. Thomas began to take part in increasingly complex meetings, traveling frequently, but always making a point of returning before the weekend. Elena, in turn, rose quickly within the company structure. His talent was recognized not only internally, but by external partners, which opened doors for him to lead larger projects. That made Thomas proud. He liked to see her being recognized, admired. He felt privileged to share his life with someone so brilliant. Still, something began to change in her gestures, something subtle, imperceptible to less attentive eyes, a silent restlessness that settled deep in her chest, especially when Elena arrived too late, too tired, too distant. Despite this, he never expressed distrust. I preferred to think that it was all part of growth, of the demands that a successful career required. I kept making her coffee every morning, I kept gardening, I kept sending flowers to her office on random dates, just to tell her I loved her. Elena reciprocated with unexpected gifts, dinners planned in detail, and sweet words whispered in the dark. Even in moments when tiredness outweighed desire, there was still affection, there was still the subtle touch of intertwined fingers under the table or a lingering kiss before bed. In the eyes of those on the outside, they were the portrait of a successful, passionate couple, building a solid story, worthy of admiration. And for a long time, that's how they felt. But the routine, this silent entity that infiltrates through the cracks of coexistence, began to take its toll. Gestures of care became more automatic. Dialogues have become more practical. The spontaneous laughter was replaced by polite smiles. There were no fights, no confrontations, just the silence expanding, gaining space between the words. Thomas noticed this, but didn't know what to name it. He was a practical man, who believed in the strength of facts and well-thought-out decisions. He was not prepared to deal with the imprecision of feelings that were beyond his control. Elena, although intuitive, also seemed to not want to see what was slowly crumbling. Both followed, like dancers who continue the choreography even when the song has ended. The arrival of a new director in Elena's sector brought new dynamism to the environment. Young, charismatic, with a modern vision of leadership and a magnetic presence, he quickly won over the team. Meetings became longer, lunches more frequent, projects more challenging. Thomas met the director at a corporate event and, although cordial, he felt a twinge of discomfort when he observed the familiarity between him and Elena. But she suppressed this discomfort like someone who ignores an insistent alarm in the middle of the night. She preferred to believe that it was just the natural jealousy of a loving husband. At that stage, Thomas began quietly working on an investment expansion that could change the company's direction. I attended meetings with investors, read reports late into the night, and even though I was tired, I found time to ask about Elena's day. He listened attentively, even when her words were full of praise for the new boss, even when her eyes sparkled in a different way as she narrated his strategies. He tried to convince himself that it was just professional enthusiasm, that it was all part of the normal growth cycle. After all, Elena has always been enchanted by brilliant minds. Outside, friends praised the couple. They talked about their harmony, their strength, their admirable partnership. And they smiled, together, at social dinners and weekend trips, as if everything was fine. No one saw the invisible space that grew between the two, no one noticed the time they spent avoiding certain conversations, the averted looks, the polite excuses for not sleeping in each other's arms. Still, there was affection. Thomas believed it. He believed with an almost naive faith that it was possible to go through any phase, as long as there was love. That's why he didn't complain, didn't pressure, didn't demand. It just did. I worked, planned, took care of everything. While Elena, even more and more absent, said what he wanted to hear. She said she loved him. And, perhaps, he really believed that, even if his gestures began to contradict his words. In the company, rumors were flying. But Thomas was always too respected to be involved in gossip. Still, there were looks, there were whispers. And he, who preferred not to listen to murmurs, continued forward. He worked in silence. He took care of the future. For him, it was all just a phase. Nothing that love couldn't overcome. But there was something Thomas still didn't know. Something that, when revealed, would not only change his life, but challenge everything he believed about love, trust, and justice. And that something was already forming like a shadow behind the days. He just couldn't see it. Yet. That morning felt like any other. The alarm clock rang at 6:45 a.m., Thomas got up first, went to the kitchen, prepared coffee and left Elena's mug positioned to the left of the counter, as he had done for years. She came down a few minutes later, already dressed, with a slightly hurried expression and her eyes immersed in notifications on her cell phone. He mumbled a good morning as his thumb scrolled frantically. Thomas watched in silence for a few moments, trying not to appear needy, although he missed the time when her first look of the day was at him. She took 2 hurried sips, kissed his cheek with an almost cruel distraction, and left before he could ask if they would have dinner together that night. The sound of the door closing remained in the room, and Thomas, instead of being surprised, took a deep breath and continued his routine as he always did. Maybe it was just another ordinary day. Perhaps. But that day, something really started to change. Thomas was having lunch with a colleague on the board when he overheard a seemingly innocent comment about Elena's boss, the new director who was being praised by everyone, including her. They said he was more lively than ever, and very well accompanied at after-work dinners. They laughed. They did not mention names. But something about that sentence kept ringing in Thomas's head with an uncomfortable persistence. It wasn't jealousy. It was instinct. That feeling that there is something out of place, something that you can't see yet, but that pulses like an invisible threat. He returned home earlier than usual that night. Elena hadn't arrived yet. He prepared the dinner they usually shared on weekends and waited. When she came in, with her makeup almost intact and her perfume still strong, she said she was exhausted and had already eaten at work. The apology came quickly, practically, and she went up to the shower before he said anything. Over the next few days, Thomas began to notice patterns that he had previously ignored. Messages deleted, calls refused when he was nearby, cell phones facing down on the table. The absent smiles, the mechanical hugs, the words spoken without a soul. He started arriving home at unexpected times, only to see her leaving in the rush of someone who doesn't want to cross paths. He began to observe. Not to trust anymore. And this break, this silent breach of trust, hurt more than any aggressive word. Thomas was a methodical man, and when he felt he was losing control of what was happening inside his own home, he decided to act. No anger, no impulses. Only with the calculated coolness that he learned to master in business. He hired a discreet detective. I didn't want assumptions, I wanted facts. I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with. And for days he pretended not to know anything. He continued preparing coffee. He continued leaving flowers on the bed. He continued smiling. Meanwhile, the relationship between Elena and her boss intensified on another level. It started with looking too long during meetings, with inside jokes, with persistent compliments. Then came meetings outside the company. First under the pretext of discussing projects, then without justification. She knew she was treading dangerous territory, but the feeling of being wanted, of being seen with hungry eyes, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. His touch was different. The way he made her laugh, the way he praised her intelligence and her sensuality. All of this fed something she thought was dormant. And she didn't resist. He preferred not to think about the consequences. He didn't think about Thomas. Or, if he did so with a silent rationalization that it was just a phase, and that it meant nothing. But it meant. The report reached Thomas on a gray morning. Photos. Schedules. Transcribed dialogues. Dinners, motels, inappropriate messages sent during work hours. He didn't know where to put his hands when he read it. He didn't know whether to cry, scream, or laugh at his own naivety. But he didn't do any of those things. He closed the folder, took a deep breath, and put it in the safe in his office. It wasn't time yet. There was still something inside him that he needed to understand. Because even though the betrayal was there, naked before his eyes, there was something he still couldn't grasp. A detail. A loose end. A feeling that screamed that this was just the surface. And he decided to wait. He decided to see how far the two of them would go. And then, act. The opportunity didn't take long. At a corporate dinner organized by senior management, where Thomas would be one of the guest speakers, Elena appeared accompanied by the new director. They weren't holding hands, there was nothing explicit, but there was the closeness of someone who shares more than just spreadsheets. There were complicit looks. There was a trace of barely concealed desire in every gesture between them. Thomas watched everything from afar. Didn't confront. He greeted them both with a calm smile. Elena, for a brief moment, looked uncomfortable, as if his face carried more than a cordial greeting. But it passed. Pretended normality. Her boss, with the arrogance of someone who believes he has won, shook her hand with exaggerated strength. Thomas just reciprocated, without saying anything. That night, however, would seal a turning point. Not because of dinner. But because, the next morning, when Thomas arrived early for a company meeting, he saw something he wasn't prepared to see. He parked the car, went up the board's private elevator, and as he passed the restaurant reserved for strategic meetings, he saw them. Elena and the boss. Alone. Together. Sunlight reflected off the wine glass even though it was only 10 in the morning. His hand covered hers on the table. And Elena. Elena didn't wear her ring. For a second, Thomas thought he was dreaming. But it wasn't. He stood still, motionless, observing the scene with painful serenity. Neither of them noticed his presence right away. When Elena finally saw him, it was as if time stopped. She froze. He tried to withdraw his hand, but it was too late. Her eyes sought his, but found no welcome. They found something colder. Inflexible. Thomas didn't say anything. He didn't ask. Just looked. For long seconds. And left. That afternoon, a silent storm began to form. Not in heaven, but inside Thomas. A plan was hatched. The pieces started to move. And what he would do from then on would forever change the trajectory of the three of them. Because Elena had chosen to get involved with someone who didn't know the weight of the consequences. And what no one knew yet, not even her, was that behind Thomas's silence there was a power that neither of them imagined. And that power would be used. But there was still something more. Something Elena could never predict. A secret kept between the lines of this story, ready to emerge at the exact moment. And that moment was closer than they imagined. The day was clear, but nothing in the atmosphere of that early afternoon matched what was about to happen. Thomas arrived at the corporate building with firm steps and a calm expression, like someone carrying a purpose that no longer allows for hesitation. He wore a dark suit, without a tie, and held in his hands an aged leather briefcase that he had carried since the times when he still believed that loyalty was an unbreakable foundation. Nobody knew, but that afternoon was scheduled. It would be the outcome of something that, silently, he had been preparing since the moment the betrayal stopped being a suspicion and was confirmed with images, gestures, and truths that no apology could erase. He had called the meeting himself, under the argument that structural changes would be announced. All directors would be present, including the current head of the communications sector, the same man who, behind the meetings and reports, nurtured a bond with Elena that went beyond ethical and marital limits. She would also be present, under the justification that her experience in crisis mediation could be useful at that meeting. Thomas arrived last, as planned. Eyes turned to him with expectation and respect. Bluntly, he began the presentation, projecting graphs, statistics and financial projections. The atmosphere looked like a typical corporate strategy meeting. Until, in a sudden moment, the screen changed. The images that appeared next froze the environment like a sharp gust of wind. It wasn't a graph. It was a sequence of records captured by security cameras, messages intercepted with legal authorization, records of meetings in hotels paid for with corporate funds. Nobody spoke. Some looked away. Others stared at the screen as if they were unable to assimilate what they saw. Elena, sitting on the right of the table, took a few seconds to understand what was being shown. When she recognized herself in one of the images, her body moved back in the chair almost instinctively, as if she wanted to disappear within herself. The boss, in turn, kept his chin up for a few seconds, trying to force some composure that had already drained from his hands. Thomas remained standing, calm, collected, and finally spoke. He explained, in detail, how those images and documents compromised the integrity of the company. He spoke about ethics, responsibility, betrayal of the trust of employees and investors. He said that, given the seriousness of what was discovered, both were formally removed from their duties from that moment on. Elena tried to interrupt. I wanted to protest. But his voice found no strength. All she managed to stammer out was, "You didn't have the right." Thomas looked at her for a long second and, without raising his tone, replied that he had every right. As a hidden shareholder of the company, with participation registered in the name of Unshielded Holding Company, as the mentor of the financial recovery plan that saved the company years ago, a plan from which his name was discreetly removed by his own choice, he not only had the right, but also the authority to make decisions in the face of a violation like that. The revelation fell like a bomb. The lover, now ex-director, looked around as if seeking support, but did not find even a sympathetic look. Elena, pale, with moist eyes, looked like she had been pushed off a cliff. I didn't know what hurt more, the exposure, the humiliation, or the loss of a man who, until then, had never raised his voice, but now stripped it away with words sharper than any scream. Thomas collected the papers from the table, ended the meeting and left without looking back. I knew there was still one last conversation to be had. One that could not occur in public. Hours later, already at home, sitting in front of the fireplace that he had lit more out of symbolism than out of necessity, he heard the door open. Elena entered. He still wore the same clothes from the morning, now wrinkled and disheveled. The eyes were red, but the posture carried a last shred of dignity. She sat down on the sofa, opposite him. For long seconds, neither of them said anything. Until she broke the silence, asking how he had the courage to expose her like that. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He observed her as if he were trying to find, there, traces of the woman with whom he was once deeply in love. Then he spoke, with a calm that contrasted with the weight of the words. He said that courage was staying by the side of someone who had already left without warning. He said that no love survives betrayal sustained by silence. He said that what she had destroyed was not just the marriage, but the very image he had of himself with her. She cried. He tried to justify it by saying that he felt invisible, that he had lost himself, that didn't mean that the love between them was over. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up and, walking to a nearby bookshelf, pulled out a sealed envelope. He handed it to her, saying only that, when he read it, he would understand everything. Elena opened it, with shaking hands. Inside, there was a copy of the company's Articles of Incorporation, signed 3 years ago, which listed Thomas's name as co-founder of one of the holding companies that secretly financed the group. But there was more. A specific clause, proposed and written by him, provided that any romantic involvement between employees, when proven to be harmful to the company's image or assets, authorized the majority shareholder to apply immediate sanctions, including summary dismissal and blocking of corporate benefits. Elena's eyes widened. The impact was not just in the revelation of the clause. It lay in the fact that he had already foreseen the possibility of being betrayed even before he was betrayed. Not out of distrust of her, but out of conviction that, one day, someone trustworthy could disappoint him. Her voice came out almost like a whisper, between muffled sobs. He asked if he had done all that out of revenge. Thomas smiled, a short, joyless smile. I said no. He said he did it for justice. Who had tried, until the last moment, to preserve the marriage, preserve her image, even preserve silence, if necessary. But, given the continuation of the lie, he had no other choice. He said he loved her. That maybe a part of him still loved. But there was no turning back. Because she, even knowing who he was within the company, even knowing his righteousness, chose to ignore it. And that, more than the betrayal itself, was what hurt, the disregard for the truth. Elena burst into tears. It fell apart. And on that wooden floor where they had so often sat together with a glass of wine, she now sobbed alone, surrounded by the echo of her own choices. Thomas walked slowly up the stairs. Not out of weakness. But because each step carried the weight of the end. In the bedroom, he opened the window and let the cold wind enter. He took a deep breath. The pain was still there. But something inside him was beginning to rearrange itself. A part that, little by little, relearned how to live without her. The next morning, he would leave for a long trip, one of those without a return ticket. Not to run away. But to start over. What Elena still didn't know was that, contrary to what she imagined, Thomas's heart no longer beat for revenge. I was pulsating for freedom. And for someone who would soon appear on the path. Someone who would arrive without pretensions, but with truth in their eyes. And there, at that exact point where many would believe everything had ended, something new, silent and deeply unexpected would begin to be born. The next morning, the house seemed emptier than ever, although they were both still there. Elena remained silent, sitting on the edge of the bed, the same one where for years she shared confidences, promises and desires with Thomas. What was left now was just the distant sound of his own thoughts, mixed with a suffocating sense of guilt and disorientation. I didn't cry anymore. She had overcome the stage of tears and was now invaded by a type of internal silence that made her forget even how to pronounce simple words. Thomas, on the other hand, had already left. She got dressed as calmly as always, but this time she didn't leave notes or look back as she walked through the door. I needed distance, air, new horizons that didn't have her fingerprints all over them. He drove for hours, without a clear direction, crossing landscapes that blurred past the car window, as if the world wanted to offer him new images to replace the ones that still haunted his memory. He arrived in a small, silent coastal town, one of those that only breathes deeply during the off-season. He rented a simple room in a wooden inn overlooking the sea. You didn't say your full name. He didn't use corporate cards. Didn't make reservations. He only asked for a room with a balcony and silence. He spent the first 2 days in complete solitude, reading the forgotten books in his suitcase, walking on the sand at dusk, letting the sea lick his feet as if each wave washed a different wound. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was just looking for a break. A time where he could feel whole again, even if just for a few moments. It was on the 3rd day, during a sudden storm, that she appeared. She was sitting alone in the inn's restaurant, reading a novel with a worn cover and laughing discreetly between sips of wine. Her laugh was neither outrageous nor rehearsed. It was a laugh that crossed his chest and made the air around him vibrate. Thomas couldn't explain why it touched him. But it rang. They ordered the same dish without knowing it. The waitress commented on the coincidence and they looked at each other for the first time. She smiled. He reciprocated. There were no chants, no insinuations. Just a silent recognition that there, at that neighboring table, was someone who also carried something in their eyes, perhaps not pain, but depth. Her name was Clara. You didn't ask about his past. She spoke little about herself. She just said that she was there to breathe, to escape the speed with which life demanded answers that she was no longer willing to give. She was an architect, had closed her office for a month and disappeared from her client's radar. Thomas didn't say he was a partner in $1 million company. He didn't tell him about the betrayal, nor about Elena, nor about what he had done in the last few days. I just said that I needed silence and that Clara seemed to understand exactly what that meant. The conversations grew like roots. Slow, deep, without fanfare. They drank coffee together in silence and walked without having to fill the time with unnecessary words. One night, Clara invited him to help her push an old boat that was stranded near the rocks. It belonged to a local gentleman who could no longer pull the weight alone. Thomas accepted, and during the physical effort, he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was still useful, that he could still offer something to someone. After that night, he slept deeply, as if his body had emptied all its reserves of tension. The next day, Clara took him to a hidden viewpoint. They sat on a large rock, overlooking the infinite, and she asked him, bluntly, if he had already forgiven her. I didn't say to whom. No need. Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he replied that he didn't know yet, but he was trying. And that was enough. Meanwhile, in another part of the world that Thomas had left behind, Elena faced the rubble. The scandalous dismissal reverberated behind the scenes of the market like an uncontrolled fire. Colleagues moved away, doors closed. The boss lover disappeared overnight, erasing tracks, avoiding interviews, protecting what little reputation he had left. Alone, Elena tried to reconstruct an acceptable version of the facts, tried to convince herself that everything had been a mistake, a lack that made her stumble. But deep down I knew it wasn't just that. I knew I had ignored signs, that I had underestimated Thomas's depth, that I had taken for granted a love that remained faithful even in silence. Tried to call. He sent long messages, some rational, others begging for a conversation. Thomas didn't answer any. I was somewhere else, geographically, emotionally. And now, for the first time in years, I felt like I had a right to be. Clara didn't demand anything from him. I didn't want to know about every detail. He said that life was made up of moments and that sometimes the past only serves to remind us of what we no longer want to be. One night, she invited him to dinner at a restaurant that was on stilts. The light was low, the food was simple, but there was something profound about the atmosphere. Between one glass and another, she held his hand and said, in a firm and low voice, that she didn't know what he was carrying, but that she realized that he had been leaving pieces of himself along the way. He said that sometimes the best way to rebuild was not to pick up the pieces, but to start something new, from scratch. Thomas looked at her as if seeing something for the first time. He didn't respond immediately. He shook her hand lightly and smiled. It was the first time in months that he had smiled like that. A whole smile. On the 8th day, Thomas received an email from the company. A formal statement confirming the transition of actions, the replacement of the management team and the completion of the dismissal process for those involved in the scandal. It was the end of a cycle. He read carefully, closed his laptop and, for the first time, felt like he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He returned to his room, packed his bags and went down to reception. Clara was waiting for him with 2 bicycles leaning against the fence. She said she wanted to take him to a special place before he decided whether to leave or not. They pedaled along a dirt road surrounded by ancient trees, until they reached a clearing where the wind made the branches sing. There was a rustic wooden table, with fresh fruit, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Clara explained that that place was a refuge that she had discovered years ago, when she needed to find herself again. They sat in silence. Thomas looked around, took a deep breath, and for the first time, he felt peace. Not euphoria. Not passion. Peace. That rare peace that only comes when you deeply understand that the worst is over. Elena kept trying. I called mutual friends. I wrote letters. He sent gifts. Not out of manipulation, but out of desperation. He finally understood what he had lost. But it was too late. In the last letter, he wrote something different. He said he didn't expect forgiveness or a return. He just said he hoped Thomas was happy, even if it was with someone else. He said that he now understood that love is not what is said, but what is preserved, even when no one is looking. Thomas read the letter by the sea, sitting on the sand next to Clara. She didn't ask the content. Just held his hand as the wind blew. And in that touch, Thomas understood that his story with Elena was over. Not with hate. But with acceptance. Days later, as they watched the sunset, Clara turned to him and asked if he already knew what he would do next. Thomas said no, but maybe it didn't matter. He said that for the first time in his life he was not in a rush to define the future. She said she just wanted to keep feeling what she felt there, next to her, a kind of silence that doesn't hurt. She smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that, watching the sky change color as if the entire universe was there to paint a new beginning. And maybe he was. The wind was colder that afternoon and the sky, dyed in tones of copper and violet, seemed to perfectly reflect what was happening inside Thomas. It had been weeks since he left everything behind, since he put an end to the life he built with Elena and began, still cautiously, to step into another reality, now with Clara. But even with the feeling of peace that was beginning to take root in his days, there was still something suspended in the air, a fragment of himself that insisted on being confronted. The pain was no longer acute, but persisted like a memory in the body, like a muscle that contracts out of habit. It was no longer about anger, about betrayal or revenge. It was about what is lost without return, about what remains even after everything is over. Thomas knew he had crossed a point of no return, but he also knew that, to move forward fully, he would need to face one last mirror, one where he was no longer a victim, nor a victimizer, but just a man who had made difficult decisions and now needed to face all the consequences. That early evening, Clara noticed the restlessness in his eyes. She wasn't the type to demand words, but she knew how to read silences. He prepared tea and sat next to him on the small balcony where they shared sunsets. Thomas remained silent for long minutes until he confessed that there was still something to be resolved. He said he had the feeling that, although everything had formally ended, emotionally the strings were still tight. Clara listened attentively, without judgment. He said there was nothing wrong with feeling that way. That forgiving didn't mean forgetting, nor forcing yourself to turn pages in a hurry. But sometimes, facing the past head-on was what really freed. Thomas looked at her as if seeking approval for something he had already decided. And she understood. I knew he needed to come back, even if for a short time. Not to recover what was left, but to close with dignity what was still bleeding, even discreetly. The next day he packed his bags. He did not promise deadlines or dates. He just said he would come back as soon as everything was resolved within him. Clara hugged him firmly, without drama. She was made of that rare kind of maturity that knows when to let go. And Thomas was gone. During the return journey, he passed through places that had become irrelevant over time, landscapes that once seemed to mean everything and were now just memories that no longer hurt. He arrived late in the afternoon and preferred not to stay in hotels. He called an old trusted friend, explained in a few words that he needed shelter for a few days and received, on the other end of the line, just a "come." Upon entering that simple house, he was greeted with a silent hug. They talked little that night. Thomas needed space, and his friend knew how to respect the times of those who carry deep wounds. On the second day, he walked to the house where he had lived for so many years with Elena. He stopped on the other side of the street and looked at the lights out. There was no movement. The grass in the garden was long, the flowers were dry. The abandonment seemed to reflect her absence, as if everything had stopped since her departure. Thomas didn't enter. He remained there for just a few minutes, standing, as if watching an invisible body. Then he turned his back and walked away. The next night, he finally responded to one of Elena's messages. "I just said I needed to talk to her in person." She responded within seconds, suggesting the cafe where they had met for the last time, even before their final separation. Thomas accepted. When he arrived, he saw that she was already there, dressed simply, her face marked by sleepless nights, but with her eyes steady. When he approached, she stood up and tried to smile. He didn't return the gesture, but calmly sat down, ordering a coffee. She didn't know what to expect. "I had accepted the meeting believing that he might be willing to reconsider something. But deep down, I feared that this was just a belated reckoning." Thomas looked directly into her eyes and said he wasn't there to discuss the past, nor to relive pain. "I was there because I felt like I had left something unfinished." He said he was not seeking reconciliation, but closure. Elena remained silent, absorbing every word. He talked about emotional responsibility, about how certain choices destroy more than a bond, they destroy the image one had of oneself. He said he didn't hate her, but he also didn't love her anymore. He said that what drove him now was just the desire to remain clean, without emotional debts, without accumulated sorrows. Elena started to cry. But it wasn't a theatrical cry. It was a contained, resigned cry. She said she understood everything now. Who for a long time lived as if love were a constant, a given, as if Thomas was there out of obligation. He said that only when he lost everything did he realize how rare he was. Thomas listened, respected the tears, but was not moved. There was no longer any pain. There was just a man and a woman who had once loved each other deeply, but who had followed paths so different that they now seemed foreign. When he got up, Elena grabbed his arm and asked if he was with anyone. He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. He just said he was fine. He didn't say names, he didn't explain details. Just that he had found peace again. And he hoped, one day, that she would find it too. Elena didn't insist. He just nodded, as if he finally understood that the story had really ended there. Upon leaving the cafe, Thomas walked through the ancient streets with the lightness of someone who had finally put an end to the most painful chapter of his life. The next morning, he packed his bags and took the flight back. On the way back to the new city, he thought about everything he had experienced in the last few months. "I no longer felt the weight of betrayal. Yes, I felt a kind of deep tiredness, the tiredness of someone who went through a silent war. But now there was room inside him for other things." When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him with a calm smile. He didn't ask anything. He just opened the door, offered him a coffee and they sat together, in silence. Time passed slowly that afternoon. Sitting side by side, they understood that what existed between them was still being built, with time, with patience, with truth. Thomas knew that the pain of the past would never completely go away. But now it no longer dominated his days. It was just a scar. Clara took a book from the shelf and began to read in a low voice. He closed his eyes and just listened. And there, on that balcony lit by a soft late afternoon light, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And that, despite everything, there was still beauty in starting over. The rain fell lightly the next morning, as if the world conspired in favor of a new rhythm, more introspective, denser. The sound of drops on the roof of the small coastal house created an almost melancholic soundtrack, but there was no sadness that day, just a stillness that filled every space with maturity and resignation. Thomas woke before sunrise, not from insomnia or restlessness, but from habit. He lay down again for a few minutes, with his eyes open, watching the timid light that was beginning to tint the white ceiling. Clara was still sleeping beside him, her body covered up to her shoulders and her face serene, completely unaware of the turmoil that had once inhabited his chest. There was something about the way she slept, trustingly, with abandon, without reservation, that touched him deeply. In that peace, Thomas found a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't need grand gestures to know he was exactly where he wanted to be. It was the simplicity that convinced him. The absence of effort. The lightness. He got up without making a sound, made coffee, and left a cup for her next to the bookshelf, with a small note, "I'll be back before lunch. I need to do one last thing." And left. The rain accompanied him the entire walk to the beach. There was no one on that stretch of coast. The kiosks were closed, the tents were covered with dark tarps, and the sea seemed to be waiting. Thomas walked to a rock he had frequented in the early days of his arrival and sat there, his feet in the wet sand and his face exposed to the salty wind. He took out of his pocket a crumpled envelope that he hadn't opened since his last trip. Inside was a last letter from Elena, which had arrived days after his return, but which he had left forgotten on the desk. It was not a letter of supplication, nor of reconciliation. It was, curiously, a story. A request for understanding. A late dive into her pain. And he finally read it. The handwritten words were shaky in places, and there were smudged ink stains that indicated that, perhaps, some tears had run onto the paper. Elena told, in detail, not the justifications for her betrayal, but the internal holes she had allowed to grow over the years. He spoke of a loneliness that wasn't his fault, but that she never had the courage to share. She spoke of the fear of having been swallowed up by routine, of having lost her own identity within a marriage that, although solid, had become too silent. He admitted his mistakes, all of them, without hesitation. She said she didn't expect redemption, just for him to understand that the love between them had been real, despite the outcome. And that, if he still carried some anger, he would release it, not for her, but for himself. Thomas folded the letter carefully and, for a moment, just closed his eyes. There was no resentment. There was a warm emptiness, like a film that ends and leaves an indefinite taste in the mouth. On the way back, he stopped by the small local produce market and bought 2 still-warm apple pies. When he arrived at the house, Clara was in the kitchen, sitting at the counter, reading a book with a red cover. She looked at him with a slight smile and didn't ask where he had been. She just got off the chair, walked over to him and took his hand. They stayed like that for a few seconds, in silence. Then Thomas led her to the table, placed the pie between them, and they sat down. While they ate, he told them about the letter. He didn't go into details. He just said that he read it, that he understood it, that he didn't keep anything else with him. Clara listened without saying anything, but held his gaze as if she understood that certain steps needed to be taken alone. Afterwards, they exchanged common words, talking about a music festival that would take place in a few days, about a renovation she wanted to do in the house, about a project that he might start with an old colleague who lived nearby. Conversations flowed naturally, without the weight of what had already been experienced. At night, the city came to life with yellow lights hanging over the narrow streets. Clara suggested a walk through the old center, where musicians played in squares and people danced naturally, as if the joy there was not performed, but lived in essence. They walked hand in hand, stopping to listen to each band, buying sweets from vendors, laughing at banal jokes. Thomas noticed that he was smiling again with his entire body, not just his face. When they passed an old book stand, Clara picked up a bound volume of poetry and read an excerpt aloud, without asking permission. It was a poem about new beginnings, about absences that, over time, become fertility for new feelings. Thomas was silent, but the way his eyes lit up was answer enough. It was as if those words had reached him at a point he didn't yet know existed. A few days later, Thomas received a call from one of the longtime board members. It wasn't about business. It was an invitation to participate as an informal advisor to a new nascent company, built from the rubble of the previous one, but with new values, new faces, new ethics. He thought for a few moments, talked to Clara that night, and together they decided that maybe it was a good idea. Not to return to the same world, but to enter it with a different perspective. It wasn't about revisiting the past, but about transforming experience into useful wisdom. He decided to accept, as long as he could maintain the life he was building now, with freedom, time and depth. And so it was. One morning, Clara woke him up before the sun rose. He said he wanted to take him somewhere special. They drove for half an hour to a hidden hill where, she said, the sunrise was unlike any other. They reached the top while it was still dark and sat down in silence. When the first rays appeared, Thomas was surprised by the intensity of the colors, by the way the sky seemed to be painted before them, like a promise being fulfilled there, before attentive eyes. Clara turned to him and said, in a firm voice, that she didn't know how long the love between them would last, but that if there was one thing she wanted to ensure, it was that he never felt like he needed to deserve affection. That he was enough just as he was. Thomas closed his eyes, moved. He squeezed his hand tightly. And in that gesture, there was a pact. Not a pact of eternity, but of truth. Presence. The dilemma that still remained within Thomas was different now. It was no longer about pain, nor about forgiveness. It was about identity. Who was he now, after everything? Was he still the man who built an empire in silence? Or the man who fell apart inside and rebuilt himself by the sea? Was he just a survivor of betrayal? Or someone who knew how to transform intimate tragedy into serene strength? Answers did not come easily. But there was something about Clara that reminded him that it wasn't necessary to define everything right away. That sometimes, living well was just living, without needing to prove anything. And then, for the first time in months, Thomas accepted it as truth. And so the days went by, not like chapters of a new epic novel, but like solid pages of a life that was reborn without fanfare. No grand endings. Only with presence, constancy, and the delicacy of someone who learned, with pain, but also with love, that every fall has the power to push us to places that we would never dare to inhabit by our own will, but that once reached, reveal what is most essential, the chance to start again. And, this time, with everything that really matters. The last few weeks had settled into a serene and unpredictable rhythm, like the sea in its rarest phases. Thomas now woke up with less weight on his chest and more anticipation for the simple taste of a shared hot coffee. The days had the taste of slow discovery, without rushing, without guilt, and even when silence appeared between him and Clara, it was a silence that welcomed, not one that pushed away. The emotional scar he carried was no longer a center of pain, but a memory that, although it pulsed from time to time, only confirmed that he had survived the storm. And more than that it was possible to live after the shipwreck. I had found purpose again, even if I was still learning the exact name of this new path. The invitation to act as an advisor to the new company had been consolidated, and he was now part of a project that prioritized integrity, ethics, and real impact. The irony was that everything he had experienced had prepared him for this. It was no longer about leading with power, but about guiding with experience. The young entrepreneurs who surrounded him admired not his resume, but his calm, his firmness, his clarity, qualities that were born from what he had lost, not from what he had achieved. Clara, in turn, had resumed architectural projects with renewed enthusiasm. She was leading the renovation of a cultural space downtown, and had invited Thomas to help her with the administrative side. Instead of refusing, he accepted. Not because he needed to keep busy, but because he had discovered a kind of balance in his partnership with her that he had never had before. They didn't need to prove anything to each other. There were no requirements. Just presence. Just true. One night, as they were reviewing floor plans for the project, she mentioned that it might be time for them to move house. He said he had found a place with bigger windows, a view of the sea, and enough space for both of them to work at home without bumping into each other. Thomas hesitated for a second, as if realizing that life was about to take another step. But then he looked into her eyes and smiled. He said he trusted his taste. And in that simple answer, he sealed the future he finally agreed to build. Meanwhile, far away, Elena faced a reality that she could no longer avoid. The professional scandal had marked her irreversibly. He tried to start over in another city, used old contacts, remodeled his resume, but discovered that a reputation, once tarnished, is not easily washed away. He opened a consultancy on his own, but clients were scarce. What used to come naturally now required a fight. And although he had talent, charisma and experience, he lacked something that cannot be regained with diplomas or recommendations: confidence. I lived alone in a small rented apartment. He had sold his old house to pay off debts accumulated during the dismissal process. The routine was silent, and the mirrors were merciless. One afternoon, while reorganizing boxes of old papers, he found the last photo taken with Thomas during a sunny weekend. They both smiled, carefree, unaware of what was to come. For long minutes, he stayed there, looking at that image like someone watching a film of a life that was no longer his. And for the first time, he didn't cry. Just understood. He understood that there was no longer any space to regain anything, and that perhaps his true punishment was not loneliness, but the full awareness of what he lost through recklessness and pride. The former director, now completely removed from the corporate world, lived in the shadow of what he was. He tried to open a disguised consultancy, tried to articulate returns through obscure contacts, but ended up involved in investigations into other poorly explained contracts under his management. Without support, he was forced to leave the country for a while. But, even far away, the echoes of what he did accompanied him. His social media went silent. His presence behind the scenes was erased by unanimous decision of the new leaders. And even among those who, in another time, would have reached out, contempt prevailed. He hadn't just lost his career. He had lost credibility. And for someone who has always lived off the glitter of status, not having a stage is a crueler punishment than any formal sentence. One afternoon, in the new house with huge windows facing the sea, Thomas and Clara decided to have a small dinner with the few friends who had become family. They sat around the table, toasted red wine, and shared stories, laughs, and comfortable silences. When the night ended and the last guests said goodbye, Clara sat on the floor of the balcony with her bare feet, watching the sky. Thomas followed, sitting next to her. She rested her head on his shoulder and, after a while, whispered that, of all the choices she made, he was the one that made the most sense. Thomas, without rushing, replied that he did not regret loving what he lost, because it was this love that prepared him to recognize the value of what he now had. And Clara, with moist eyes and a light heart, shook his hand in silence. There, on that clear night, under the sky dotted with stars, two rebuilt hearts celebrated not oblivion, but the freedom that comes when accepting the entire truth, without idealizations, without fear. Thomas's story was not about revenge, nor about banal overcoming. It was about humanity. About how even those who love deeply are capable of making mistakes. And about how those who are hurt have the right, and the power, to start over. It was about choices. And about consequences. About looking into the abyss, diving into it, and still coming back to the surface with something valuable in your hands: self-knowledge, peace, maturity. And most of all, it was about love. The real one. One that does not appear to fill holes, but to expand horizons. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Write your opinion in the comments, it's very important to us. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because every week you'll find intense, deep and surprising stories like this one. And never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show, through fiction, how much wrong choices can ruin real lives. Until the next story.